Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for attending. This is Global Trade and the Environment. That's what we have as today's topic. Before we begin, I want to lay out a few procedural points. Veterans will recognize all of this. At the end of the session, we will hold a question and answer portion as time allows. You can ask questions through the Q&A function on the right of your screen. Your questions will only be visible to you and the Flexport team. We will also share a slide deck at the end of the presentation. All right, and now to make the lawyers happy, in our next slide, this is the part that makes the lawyers happy. Please do keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. All right. Who are we and what do we bring to the table? I'm Phil Levy. I'm Chief Economist at Flexport. I bring a lot of naivete about trade and the environment, but fortunately, I've got experts with me to help sort everything out. So first, as one of our two guests, we've got two guests and a colleague. So as one of our guests, we are fortunate to have Dan Rutherford, a program director at the International Council on Clean Transportation. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Phil.
All right, terrific. We also have Jean-Marc Bonello, Principal Consultant at UMass International. Welcome, Jean-Marc.
Hi, Phil. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
And then we also have my colleague, David Hume, who is Head of Climate Programs at Flexport.org, who is joining us from very early in the morning out in the island. David, welcome.
Thanks, Phil. Excited to be here.
Yes. So we are spanning the globe today. We have Europe, we have the continental North America, and we have Hawaii. So hopefully this will all come out seamlessly for all of you. So what's on the agenda? Well, we're in such close proximity to Earth Day, we thought it'd be very interesting to catch up on what's going on with trade and the environment. And in particular, we're going to concentrate mostly on prospects for reducing emissions in the maritime and aviation sectors. So this is hardly the only thing going on with trade and the environment, of course, but it's an important one for reasons that we'll be discussing throughout the session. So the first part is why? Why are we talking about? The second part, we'll talk about what's going on with maritime. Third part, we'll be talking about what's going on with aviation. And then in the end, we'll try to bring this all together and be forward-looking, talk about what policies are coming down the road, and what's likely to affect businesses, what people should expect as they make plans for the future in this increasingly important part of global transportation. So before we get to any of that, though, as is our wont, we're going to start with a poll. We're going to ask you all what you think going into this. You'll find the poll button over on the side. So the question we'd like you to start with is, how important is it that the logistics and transportation sector contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? So here are your choices. 1, not very. This is a fad. This is anonymous, right? 2, they just want to go after these sectors because they're international, not domestic. It's unfair. 3, it's important to address, but there's no particular reason to focus on the transportation sector. 4, there's plenty to do in transportation, and it's the sector we can affect, so we should. 5, there are serious efficiency reasons to focus on this sector above others. So I read all of that without seeing where you all were. Let me encourage you to sort of voice your opinion. It is anonymous. We don't, at least at the moment, see what thing you're putting in. And let's see what we're getting. We are getting, there's, I'd say, somewhere between, let's see, actually holding at a majority. There's plenty to do on transportation, and it's a sector we can affect, so we should. All right, that's great. I thank you all for participating. By the way, so we have if you add in there's serious efficiency reasons, perhaps this says who's going to show up for a webinar on trade and the environment, but fairly strong support for doing stuff. And so that's great because it's going to lead us into what's out there, what might we do. And actually, I'm going to move to David and ask, where do you come down on this? Is this the important sector to be looking at, or why I know you think it is. So why do you think this is an important sector to be looking at?
Great, thanks, Phil. That's a great question, and I'll probably preface by saying I'm a little biased here and why we're going to be talking about this today. But why are we here talking about transportation decarbonization? when we think about climate change, there are an infinite number of ways for us to categorize emissions by source. And so if we go to this next slide, please. Great. So shown here in this chart from the International Energy Agency, this is a simplified view of total energy-related emissions broken out by sector. The most emissions-intensive sectors are therefore power generation, industry, transportation, and buildings. You can see that here in this pie chart. So the transportation emissions account for around 23% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is quite substantial when you think about it. So in the global context, transportation sector is a very big slice of the emissions pie, as it were. For that reason, it is an important area for us to discuss today. We can head over to the next slide, please. So to dive a little bit deeper on this, this is a chart pulled from the recent IPCC report. And in 2019, greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector were around 8.7 gigatons. That's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we were to carve that out by transportation mode in a little more detail, you can look here at the legend to follow along with me, but around 70% of all these emissions came from road vehicles like passenger cars and trucks. 1% came from rail, relatively small amount, and then 11% and 12% respectively came from shipping and aviation sectors. And so here at Flexport, we like to talk about freight, and that usually comes down to ocean and aviation. So let's look at those subsectors in a little bit more detail. These are what we refer to as hard to abate subsectors, aviation and maritime specifically. For long haul transport using planes and vessels, it is not practical with today's technology to simply electrify these subsectors using batteries. The energy demands are just simply too great. If we were to think about trying to put batteries on a container ship, it would be really impractical for an ocean-going container ship that carries around 16,000 TEU. It's just not there. So the hard part then is that we will need other technologies and solutions for us to decarbonize these subsectors, more likely a basket of emission reduction measures. And that's one of the topics we'll discuss today here with our other guests. Unfortunately, we really haven't seen the progress that we would like to see in the maritime and aviation sectors. Emissions have been trending upwards, unfortunately. I think most folks here are probably familiar with the Paris Agreement from 2016 that set forth the goal of, quote, pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement, you may not know, did not specifically cover emissions from international shipping and aviation. And so there are two UN regulatory bodies that oversee global shipping and aviation. They are respectively the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, and the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. And so while ICAO and IMO have established emission reduction targets for 2030 and 2050, we are not on track to meet those targets as of right now. So hopefully that gives you some really useful context about transportation and climate change, and more specifically why aviation and maritime are particularly important in the discussion as hard to abate sectors that will require more effort to decarbonize. That's one of the reasons I'm really excited here to have our guests, Jean-Marc and Dan, so we could talk about these sectors in a little more detail.
With that, I'll do that. That's a great lead into that. Before we do, while we stay general and kind of frame the issue, Dan, let me come to you first, and thank you for that, David. Dan, let me come to you. When you talk about sort of why is the transportation sector an important one, can you talk about that? And then also, are emissions the right, like greenhouse gas emissions, the right thing to look at? How much of the environmental story is that for someone who's concerned about climate environment?
Certainly. Happy to weigh in here, Phil, and thanks, David, for the introduction here. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to maybe break out the aviation component a little bit more. So the figure here shown in the graphic is all of aviation. So this includes both passenger transport and freight transport. If we want to drill down and talk specifically about freight, you should understand that to be about 15% of all commercial aviation emissions. So, in 2019, commercial airlines emitted about 920 million tons of CO2. About 15% of that is freight. And it divides up pretty evenly between dedicated freight and what we call belly freight. So that's the freight component that's carried in the cargo hold of a passenger aircraft. So just wanted to offer that context since we are talking about trade today. I get to cover both of these modes, both maritime shipping and aviation, although I'll speak mostly to aviation today. And they're about 25% of the transport carbon dioxide emissions. But Phil, you are correct. I mean, most people focus on the CO2 because it's the most long-lived impact. And it's also the one that scales directly with fuel consumption and therefore fuel costs. But there is another component of the climate impact of actually both modes, and those are what we call short-lived climate pollutants. So those are other air pollutants that are also emitted when you burn fossil fuels. And those also impact the climate. They're particularly important for aviation because when you burn a gallon of jet fuel at elevation, in addition to CO2, you're emitting nitrogen oxides, you're emitting black carbon, and also water vapor. And the particulate and the water vapor function, those tend to increase contrail impact. And there's a little bit of uncertainty about this, but we know that contrails are a net climate forcer. And in total, the short-lived climate pollutants could impact global warming twice as much as CO2 alone. So increasingly, you'll see what are called a radiative forcing index, or RFI. It's basically a multiplier that are built into carbon calculators to take into account short-lived climate pollutants. And oftentimes, they'll use a factor of 2.6 to 3 just to take into account these short-lived climate pollutants above and beyond the carbon dioxide impact.
So do I interpret that then as the overall damage is 2.6 to 3 times as high as if you just measured the carbon dioxide emissions?
That's correct. And there is uncertainty because it's in the name, short-lived climate pollutants. They're fundamentally different timescale impacts. But that's correct. There's 2.6 to 3 times the climate impact of just CO2 alone.
Okay, no, that's very interesting. And when you are telling your friends what you do and you know, why do you think that the transportation sector, you know, has, I don't know whether it's a starring role, you can tell me whether it has a starring role, but is prominent in these discussions of reducing emissions? Is it the numbers that we saw, or is there any more to it?
No, I think David gave a good summary. I mean, the issue is different a little bit across passenger cars versus trucks versus ships and planes, but it is, about a quarter of the total emissions. It tends to grow quickly, and transportation generally tends to be a luxury good. So as people get more disposable income, they tend to travel more. And so in addition to kind of the technological barriers, we just assume that the economics is going to tend to drive people to travel more and buy more goods from afar. So we know we're going to be talking about this problem for many decades to come.
That's a very good point. Jean-Marc, let me ask you to weigh in. What's your perspective on this, both the sort of relative importance, and are there other things, say, in the maritime sector that are also important in addition to the greenhouse gas emissions?
Thanks, Phil. Yes, so to quantify, as Dan started out, so shipping accounts for similarly around 920, 930 megatons of CO2, so similar to aviation in our lost inventory carried out by the IMO. But shipping is accountable for moving around 80% of all freight that moves around in the world. So basically everything around you at some point has probably been on a ship. So obviously there's a really different dynamic who is looking at shipping. Sort of shipping is almost perceived to be behind the scenes until something blocks the Suez Canal, and then suddenly it comes up on everyone's radar. But it is definitely an important sector to decarbonize because it has knock-on effects for everyone's supply chain as well. So, as I said, with most companies and most businesses, you'll find maritime transport in those companies' carbon inventories as well. And by nature, it's quite an interesting and complicated sector to decarbonize because of the diversity of the sector as well. So
we're going to dive into those details in just a minute.
Okay. But yeah, so coming back to your point, maybe about greenhouse gas emissions and not only CO2. So I think the most relevant aspect of it when it regards to shipping would be methane. So methane is a greenhouse gas that has around 30 times more damaging than CO2. So for every ton of methane is equivalent to sort of 30 tons of CO2 emitted. And methane is basically what might be known as LNG, or liquefied natural gas, which you might be familiar with. So one of the problems is that LNG is sometimes marketed as a solution or a transition fuel, but it has really very serious implications in terms of greenhouse gas performance as well. So it's something to be aware of when looking at the sort of arsenal of tools that we have to decarbonize the sector in the future.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. David, did you want to sort of come back with your perspective on sort of what else is there, or the relative importance of emissions and these other issues? I know you think very broadly about this.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe just to sort of wrap this up, or just think a little bit more forward-looking. So as we think about some of these other sectors that are decarbonizing more rapidly, maybe passenger vehicles, for example, as those start to decarbonize more rapidly, and maybe aviation and maritime might start to lag behind, I'd love to get your thoughts, Dan and Jean-Marc. Like, do we foresee that these sectors start to become a larger and larger slice of the emissions pie of the total? Is that a concern that we're going to be seeing in the near future?
Well, I can take that for aviation first. Yes, there have been a number of assessments on this question. And it's a natural question to ask because formally both sectors have been left out of like a lot of the policy mechanisms of the Paris Agreement. And so you can model this. You know, what happens if countries meet their Paris obligations, but shipping and aviation don't reduce emissions accordingly? Specifically for aviation, the conclusion is, you know, by 2050, somewhere between 12% and 25% of emissions could be associated with aviation. I mean, that's 25% in particular is a really big number, but that's if like countries go net zero, but airlines don't. That would be kind of the upper bound to how bad things could get.
Jean-Marc, you have a reaction?
Yeah, similarly, as Dan said, shipping tends to there's a risk that it sort of might slip between the cushions and the sofa and is ignored. But similarly, projections can vary quite a bit. I think for maritime, the number might be closer to maybe 17% of global emissions if nothing is done. So there are serious implications that need to be considered. Yeah.
Now, let me just, as I know David was going to close off, but let me do one follow up on this. You know, we sort of organized a little bit on the premise that the regulation and the oversight is sort of sector specific, and we'll talk about it that way. You've raised Paris. To what extent, we'll get into the details in a minute, but just broadly, are the sort of pressures to decarbonize coming from broader international efforts or sector-specific efforts, like just maritime or just aviation? And Jean-Marc, why don't we start with you?
Yes, I'd say in shipping, we're seeing a really interesting dynamic where industry is actually the driving force, which is pushing for more ambitious targets or sort of cleaner provision of transport, of maritime transport. And that is driven by several different things. Some climate demand, when people are conscious of climate risk about inaction now, and doing anything later on might be more expensive and more risky and more disruptive, while sort of policy is still catching up slowly. So I think at the moment the drivers would be sort of more risk-based perceived from the actors that are in shipping, so the shipping companies, the ship owners, and the transport providers themselves. I think that's the biggest driver.
Not coming as much from sort of very broad international agreements.
Because as sort of Dan and Dave said, it doesn't fit squarely under anyone's responsibility, but the IMO's. The IMO's current strategy is not ambitious enough. But sort of social expectations and also some other industry-led initiatives by financiers or maritime insurers or cargo owners are driving that ambition much quicker than sort of any overarching policy.
Okay, interesting. We're going to come back to the IMO in just a second. Dan, you introduced the Paris idea. Just the sort of how much is this sort of broad international talk? How much is this sector specific? How do those weight when it comes to aviation?
Yeah. So it's similar, I would say, to maritime shipping. However, the consumer component is really important on the aviation side. And to define that, I'm talking about the individual flyer as opposed to like the freight forwarder or the cargo company. So we started to see a lot of pressure coming out in Europe around 2019. You probably read some news articles around it. There's a movement in Northern Europe called the flying shame movement, which started to cause people to really question how much they fly and the relative contribution of that to climate change. And then Greta Thunberg, the activist, really ran with that. You might recall that she made a trip to the United Nations meeting in New York by catamaran instead of flying back in 2020 or 2019. And that really galvanized a lot of the activists around the flying issue. That has led to pressure on the airlines to show that they have a viable pathway to net zero emissions. And the airlines and their groups are now really bringing the case to governments, including the International Civil Aviation Organization, that we need to have clear climate targets and supportive policy to get them to net zero. So that's kind of been the movement. I would say in many ways, governments are catching up, and it's the airlines reacting to consumer concern about climate change that is really driving the political debate.
Okay, that's helpful. So we're going to be very shortly turning to the specifics of what's on the table, what can one do in each of these sectors, and we're going to take them separately for the reasons you just heard, and also delve into a little bit more like what is the IMO and who's regulating what. Before we do that, though, we've got another poll. We want to hear from all of you. So as a lead-in to that, before we've actually even told you what the options are for decarbonization, we'll get there. Let me ask, just to get your initial reaction, how much more would you pay to reduce or neutralize the greenhouse emissions from transporting goods? A little bit vague. Let me give you some options, and you pick the one that's closest to how you feel. So first, however much I support the thought, my goal is to get goods as quickly and cheaply as I can. No additional costs welcome. 2, I'd pay 0 to 10% more. 3, I'd pay more than 10% if it would help the environment. 4, instead of money, I'd be willing to accept a transit time of 0 to 10% longer. 5, instead of money, I'd wait more than 10% longer if it would help the environment. All right, and now where are we? Oh, it's a very close race between these. So we're in the, it's actually, so we're getting a somewhat practical plurality. Oh, it's going back and forth. But basically, roughly more than 10% longer, or okay, now we're going into 0 terms. It's hard to characterize as you all weighing in. Thank you for that. It's great to see what people think. So I guess this is going to be one of the questions as we delve into the next section, and it looks like time is the thing. So actually, I'm going to take that as our lead-in, given what people are saying, and pay attention to the vote. And Jean-Marc, as we start talking about some of the maritime questions, maybe you can talk us through a little bit, what are the options for decarbonization? If I want to lower emissions in the maritime sector, what does the menu look like? And is it a trade-off between things like slow steaming, or what are my choices?
Excellent. Yes, so there's, as David alluded to, needs to be a basket of solutions. There's no cliche silver bullet to do this. And part of that comes from sort of several factors that characterize shipping as an industry. It's an international industry where sort of ships are floating around different parts of the world, operating in different regions. There are several different kinds of ships who handle very diverse cargo, and also dealing with very different clients with different requirements as well. So in this case, when sort of as the poll showed, being willing to maybe slow things down is one of the easiest and sort of lowest hanging fruit that we see in shipping. And that can be characterized as maybe slow steaming, but I think more accurately it would be something closer to voyage optimization. So rather than, if you know there's port congestion in Long Beach, why not slow down instead of waiting for 5 days outside the port? Slow down, reduce your emissions significantly, do so in a safe way, and you're basically still in a win-win. You're still satisfying your delivery date as well. So that's sort of on the more operational side. And
so that one, if I could just jump in for a second, so that one essentially requires port efficiency, right? That you can sort of glide towards a preset slot as opposed to hurry up and get your place in the queue.
Exactly, or communication more than anything, or creating some kind of air traffic control system where you know what your place in the queue is and you just aim to get there at that time. So there's various ways of applying this. Some might call it virtual arrival, but intrinsically it's trying to avoid rushing to a place and then waiting, but also just slowing down the whole industry. Even by a few percentages can have a dramatic effect. So we've done several studies to show that that would be one of the easy wins for shipping across the board, which could work. And then as we move sort of towards
I want to know from the studies, I will confess, I just pulled that 0 to 10% stuff out of a hat. You're the one who's actually looked at this stuff carefully. What are we thinking about when you do a study and you say, look, we can get some nice gains from slower? How much slower or better organized?
So actually, I have the exact numbers in front of me right now. So for on average, so this is obviously an average number for a container ship. If you slow down by 10%, you're looking at a gain or a reduction in fuel consumption of somewhere in the ballpark of between sort of 10, even 20% in some certain cases. And that's because of the relationship of fuel consumption and velocity and the naval architecture of ships. So it is quite a significant chunk. And that, if you add that onto technological solutions like retrofitting to make your hull more streamlined, or maybe using wind as part of your propulsion, that can obviously increase that advantage that you have. And these are the kinds of solutions that we're looking at in this decade. So right between now and maybe 2030, where we still don't have a clear outlook on what zero emissions or low emissions fuels look like, what the supply looks like for those, and technologies are still scaling up. So those are things that we can do in this decade. But taking a longer term approach, the discussion moves towards a change in fuel. So this is a big paradigm shift towards thinking more about what fuel you're using on board and looking at it from a life cycle perspective as well. So just rather than just looking at it from the impact that it has just when it's burnt on the ship, but also thinking of where it's coming from and the whole production and transportation life cycle of that fuel. And there's quite a few candidates out there. Those range from maybe biofuels, which are the easiest drop-in fuels, which you can just plug into an existing engine right now on a ship. And they get more and more sort of complicated and require more change, both on the technology on board the vessel, but also in the supply chain and production, but also maybe supply of renewable electricity to produce things like hydrogen or ammonia, which can have an almost zero life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, but require a complete overhaul to the way that we think about fueling the maritime industry.
Hey, Jean-Marc, real quick question on the alternative fuels piece. At the moment, this might be a little bit into the weeds, but is there any regulation that essentially requires folks to consider these fuels on a full life cycle basis?
I think the closest that we have right now is the Fuel EU maritime policy. So the EU, just 3 or 4 weeks ago, has put in place a system where there needs to be an incremental shift for shipping some maritime fuel towards these low and zero emission fuels. And it set a timetable from now up to 2050, which incrementally goes up to 80% in 2050. And that is on a life cycle basis. So I think that's the main one. But there's discussions at the IMO to upgrade what the current strategy is. So the current strategy is only on the operational side, so what we would call tank to wake emissions. So hopefully we might see that expanding to include the whole life cycle emissions.
So let me jump in with that one, because we've mentioned the IMO a few times. This is the International Maritime Organization. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that, who they are, how they make decisions, and just how this all and how what is their relative importance.
So yes, so the IMO is a UN led body, and like most UN bodies, basically it's a room with country delegates from all of the countries in the UN. And they bring forward what they think should be discussed, and the IMO basically provides a platform to do that. One of the several committees in the IMO is the MEPC, the Maritime Environment Protection Committee, where all of this emissions discussion falls under. And basically the sort of most important regulation that currently is set by the IMO, its initial strategy, which aims to reduce emissions from shipping by 50% by 2050 compared to 2008 levels. So that's sort of the guiding principle that's currently guiding. Thanks, that's really helpful. So basically the red line is what the IMO has set in place as its target. And also, as can be seen in the chart, however, from an emissions inventory that was also commissioned by the IMO, called the fourth greenhouse gas study, projections of emissions from shipping going out to 2050 are more likely to increase by 30% or stay relatively stable, maybe decrease slightly, and in a business as usual scenario. So this is assuming that trade keeps growing at a rate that is projected for specific scenarios, and technology and shipping and the operational style of shipping sort of not significantly changing. So as you can see, there's a big gap from where we are now to where we need to get to. And the IMO has, because of the way it works and because it is mostly driven by the politics of compromise rather than the science, it takes a long time to get things written down in paper, and then even longer time to get that filtered down into the domestic legislation, which would need to enforce all of this.
Maybe just to jump in here real quick with one small comment. The black line at the top, I just want to call out real quick, that ship operating life. So the vessels that are being designed and built today will still be in operation by 2050 when that IMO target comes into, hopefully we realize it. So what that essentially means is that this is not a wait and see kind of activity. We need to be designing the solutions we need for the future today, because those ships are starting to hit the water. So this is really why I think we want to emphasize the need for action as soon as possible.
That's a good point. Dan, you wanted to weigh in on the IMO.
Yeah. So thank you, Jean-Marc. That was a really nice explanation of IMO. Just wanted to add one thing, because it's important to the contrast between maritime shipping and aviation. So IMO does have a pretty powerful legal instrument. You'll hear it referred to as the MARPOL Convention, or the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. Originally, it was focused on air and water pollution, but since 2019, there have been an increasing number of greenhouse gas requirements that have been added to MARPOL. It's a pretty powerful international treaty, and what's important is if you're a signature to a chapter in MARPOL and it gets amended, that becomes legally binding on your country. And that's really important. There will always be an interplay between sort of regional policymaking and UN policymaking. There's always going to be a back and forth on that. IMO is pretty strong in what it can legally require. The contrast is ICAO, which I'll talk about shortly. There's no MARPOL equivalent within ICAO. Basically, everything that's decided there is fundamentally aspirational, and it's government's job to implement and to regulate. And that's an important distinction between the two modes.
Well, that's a good point, and we'll be coming to that in just a moment, but it's good to have that contrast. When we look at this chart, and given the discussions that we've just had, what should my takeaway be? Is it that we've set the right goal, but now we've got to do a bunch of things to meet it? Is it we set the best goal we could, but even that's not necessarily sufficient? Jean-Marc, what do I take from all this?
So I think the message I'd like everyone to take back home is that, the target itself is completely inadequate, or more accurately, misaligned with what the IPCC is telling us, both in terms of scale. So 50% obviously in 2050 is not enough, but also in terms of urgency as well. So there's no interim targets for shipping either. It's just this 50% by 2050. Hopefully, as we'll talk maybe later on, we are looking at an update to that. But I think what we should take home is that this is at odds with what the IPCC, which is another part of the UN, is telling us needs to happen by 2050 in order to avoid climate crisis.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Hey, let's move to air. And because we want to make sure we give equal time in the air. Dan, you started out, maybe we can sort of pick up on what you raised. We talked about the International Maritime Organization as the sort of regulatory body. You've just been saying that AIR's regulatory body is not as empowered. Tell us who they are and how has this worked so far?
Yeah. Happy to. So the equivalent to IMO on the aviation side is the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO is the acronym. Yeah. So that's the UN agency that governs civil aviation worldwide. It actually is younger and newer than IMO, which has been around for much longer. It was formed basically after World War II as a means to promote the growth of civil aviation. Relative to IMO, it's not an implementation organization. It's really a coordination organization. So there is a Chicago Convention. It does kind of govern the workings of ICAO and how the member states contribute to it and relate to one another. But it is fundamentally a coordination body. The history of how ICAO has grappled with climate change is not a particularly pretty one. So full history, go back to almost 25 years now. We had the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first attempt for governments to coordinate around climate change in a really concrete way. Kyoto Protocol said, okay, shipping and aviation, we're going to remit those to IMO and ICAO. And ICAO kind of did nothing for 20 years, to be quite blunt. It wasn't until 2016 that ICAO finally came to an agreement on something. That something was fundamentally, let's not try and force emission reductions in sector from planes and fuels because that would be expensive. Let's require offsetting instead. So buying carbon credits from the forestry sector, for example. That was the first pass. We did get better. In 2022, ICAO agreed to a net zero target for international aviation. So by 2050, airlines and governments should aspire to have net zero emissions. And this would require, 90% reductions from business as usual emissions. So that's the good news. We did get that out of ICAO in 2022. So it went a little bit further than IMO did in 2018. But the question now is how to implement this. And it fundamentally gets remit back to the countries. They have the power and the responsibility to regulate their industries, and figuring out how to do that and to promote technologies and to raise revenue and get these technologies matured and deployed. That's the big question. And how to do that without distorting trade is something that a lot of smart minds are thinking about right now.
And have they figured out the answer?
I have my answer. I don't know if you want me to talk about that or dive into technologies. Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of different proposals about how you would allocate international emissions to countries. And that's important because, that's the basis of regulation, right? You need to know how much is being emitted, who's responsible for it before you can mandate a technology or charge for the emissions or whatnot. For aircraft, I think it's is relatively simple, that in my opinion, each country should have responsibility for controlling emissions from planes that depart its airports. So if you have a plane that flies from LA to Chicago, that's purely domestic. The US has responsibility for those emissions. If you have a plane that flies from LA to Beijing, those emissions also would be the responsibility of the US. When that plane returns from Beijing to LA, those emissions would fall under the responsibility of the Chinese government. And what this does is it allows you, first of all, to make sure that you don't distort trade across a common route. You would have common responsibilities for all airlines, regardless of where they are registered. That's one point. The second point is it allows for differentiation of ambition. So if the US wants to have, for example, a higher carbon charge, because we're a larger contributors to historical emissions, for example, that's allowed. China could also quite reasonably argue, hey, we need more runway for economic development. We're going to impose a less strict regulation or lower carbon charge. They could also do that. It allows both for differentiation, but also avoids the problem of distorting competition.
So that's very helpful. I like the lack of distortions. I know that in at least other areas of environmental debate, there's been a big question: which countries should take on which obligations? How much stage of development is that equally true for aviation? Decarbonization discussions.
It is debated widely within ICAO without resolution to date, is what I'd say. Okay. So one of the limitations to the net zero target that was agreed last year is, first of all, there are no interim targets. So there are no 2030 targets, no 2040 targets. But also it's just a global goal. It has not been differentiated to countries yet, and therefore it has not been assigned to airlines that are registered in a country. So it's a key question. Actually, something we're analyzing in detail right now is, there's general agreement that the richer countries need to move faster and go further on decarbonization, but how much faster is not defined yet. And we're actually doing the detailed modeling right now to create country pathways that sum up to net zero, but do allow for a little more room to grow in the emerging economies.
That's very interesting. Is there a consensus about sort of the rank ordering of technological solutions, whether it's sort of different fuels? I know you can't really low steam airplanes, although as Jean-Marc was saying, that may not be the right way to think about it at all. It might be efficiency, like how having less time with planes circling overhead. How should we think about the technological options in the aviation sector?
Yeah. So I'll talk first about the carbon dioxide component, since that's the most well understood. There have been a number of technology roadmaps released, looking out through 2050 and trying to understand what technologies and what strategies will be most important to decarbonizing. We've released one ourselves. It's called Vision 2050. It's on ICCT's website. We look at 5 big levers. So fuel efficiency is lever 1. So that is newer planes and also operational improvements like higher load factors that burn less fuel per unit payload. There are what are called sustainable aviation fuels, and those are drop-in replacements to fossil jet fuel, either made from a biofuel feedstock or like a power-to-liquids fuel. There are zero-emission planes. Fundamentally, this is about hydrogen potentially, since the role of battery electric planes is very, very small due to their mass constraints. There will be some mitigation from modal shift. We've looked at this for passengers, and we think it's pretty small, like shifting people from planes to high-speed rail. It works in certain markets, but like the US, there's not even a rail network really to manage it. But it could be important to freight, and here's why. Ballpark, to move a ton of cargo on a plane requires about 100 times more energy than to move it by a ship. And it varies a little by the ship type, and not all goods can be moved by both. But it's much more energy intensive and therefore carbon intensive to move freight by plane than by ship. So as we start to see policies which increase the cost of fuel somewhat, I think that will reverberate across the choices that freight forwarders need to make about how to move freight. And modal shift could be important. We could see more air freight being carried by ships over time. Sorry, that was a bit of a diversion. Fifth bucket was economic incentives. So carbon pricing is going to be part of the solution. So if you look at those, clean fuels, so those are sustainable aviation fuels and zero emission planes, generally we believe that will provide about 60% of the total mitigation needed from aviation. Fuel efficiency is about a third. And then modal shift and economic incentives are the remainder. So clean fuels is the lion's share of the mitigation. Challenge there is getting supply moving, bringing costs down, and also making sure that we distinguish between good fuels and bad fuels.
And is that last point, actually, I'll even invite David in here because otherwise I'm just simply parroting what I've heard from him before. But if we think about sort of the lifetime emissions of the fuels, is that what you mean by the distinction between good and bad?
Exactly. So it's really important to assess the greenhouse gas emissions of a fuel across its entire life cycle. So that's fuel production, distribution, and combustion. And there are some fuels that look good on a combustion basis, but if you look at the amount of energy used to produce them, they can actually be worse than the fossil fuel baseline. So yeah, that's key, is getting the assessments done properly.
And is there any incentive right now to sort of pick a fuel with sort of a better life cycle performance over one that's worse?
Sure. I thought someone was trying to weigh in there. I don't know.
Well, I was going to weigh in on that particular question, Phil. I just wanted to emphasize
Please.
that to Dan's point, even fuels that go by the same name can have vastly different emissions depending on the feedstocks or ingredients that go into them and how they're produced. And so be very cognizant of that fact when someone says they have a biofuel even. What goes into that biofuel? What feedstocks? Are they sustainable? How is it produced? Those things matter very much when we look at the full life cycle emissions of all these fuels. So all fuels are not created equal, unfortunately.
Okay, so I am going to defer to our next section the question, but keep it in mind of who sorts all this out and how or are they going to. But before we do that, let's call the audience in one last time, and we're going to ask our final poll question to lead into our sort of policies and prospects discussion. So we've just been talking about major emissions reductions, the net zero or the goal for 2050. So for the audience, do all of you interpret those goals as, only 4 choices here, reasonable? It takes time to adopt this sort of change. This very likely will happen. Next, unreasonable. The target should be more aggressive in timeline and reduction amounts. Or unreasonable, these goals are unachievable no matter how far in the future they are. Or lastly, I need to know more about the goals and how hard they are to meet. So let me ask everyone to weigh in. I'm going to skip to result here. All right, so we have, it looks like we have optimists, at least in the plurality, although it's actually a fairly even spread across these. Optimists are breaking more into the lead as we come around the bend. Okay, thank you all for weighing in on that. It looks like it's a plurality that's optimistic, that thinks we've mostly got this right, but not a majority, and we gave people some different ways to go. We've got a decent chunk who thinks they've got some doubts. All right, well then let me turn to all of you, the experts. And maybe I'll start with Jean-Marc, since you've been waiting patiently. What is your take? You've already said that you don't think that the current goals are sufficient. What do you think will happen? Do you think we'll meet even those goals? Do you think we'll get things that are more stringent? What's your expectation?
Well, we can talk about expectations and hope are slightly different. But yes, so definitely, I think it's more than sort of what I think. It's what the science is telling us about these zero or net zero targets by 2050. They are, again, inadequate with what the climate science is telling us should be our ambition by the end of the mid-century. By mid-century. So sort of looking forward, if things stay the way they are, we are looking at sort of efficiencies gradually increasing, but that's not because we're behaving differently. It's because we're building ships bigger, for example, or tweaking things slightly. But that's not the kind of change or rate of change that we need. There is a glimmer of hope coming down the line for shipping, especially, which is the next big MEPC, so the Environmental Committee meeting that will happen in summer this year. So in July, all of the countries at the IMO have this chance to alter the course for the future of shipping and move and decide what the future should look like. So they're updating their target. And what I would like to see is not only that target going from 50% to zero by 2050, but also setting some interim targets in between, so 2030 and 2040. And one way to do that is being led by the science and using something that is a science-based target. So some of you might be familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, whose sole existence is setting sector-specific targets for specific sectors that is in line with what the science is telling us, but also takes into account specificities of the industry. So the SBTI tells us that we need to see a massive ramp up in emission reduction, so something on the scale of 30% reduction by 2030 and 96% reduction by 2040. So basically, that already brings the target closer to us than 2050. And this is one of the more ambitious targets that's being discussed at the IMO. So hopefully, shipping as an industry has this opportunity to really move the goalposts to make them make sense and align with the ambition that society needs it to take. There's really positive signals. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Real quick, this question, can you maybe comment quickly on the audience, or quickly for the audience, on whether these IMO targets, if they are increased in ambition, do they have any teeth? Like, are there any requirements that we actually have to meet these?
So I think as Dan said, there is a legal framework that goes with what the IMO says. However, obviously, that then needs to be implemented by the countries, and that might be through flag states or through different mechanism. But yes, so this is definitely something that will become part of maritime law, and hopefully enter the domestic discussion as well. And I think what's really positive is seeing national policies starting to move that way before waiting for the IMO. So we've seen, just today, the G7 committing to accelerating decarbonization for shipping specifically, domestic policy specifically, like the US especially, and the UK setting itself really ambitious targets that are aligned to something close to these science-based targets. I think it does have teeth, but it's also great to see people preemptively, or countries preemptively, moving towards that before it even being part of the regulation.
So I want to get to Dan in just 1 second with very similar questions. But as businesses are looking at this going forward, you've talked about this distinction between doing what the science demands versus sort of reaching consensus and perhaps taking the easier way. If we take those two things, where one possibility is you go with a scientific imperative, the other is you essentially make it so that the teeth aren't going to leave any marks. That you agree to do what is reasonably simple to do. I realize it's not really a dichotomy like that, but where do you think we're likely to come down given what you've seen so far? Is it likely to be science leading, or is it likely to be enough so it doesn't cause too much discomfort? This is for you, Jean-Marc.
It's, as I said before, it's always a political compromise, and science usually is left on the back seat. However, sort of there's this, which is quickly becoming cliche as well. You can't really negotiate with climate science. It is driven by very complicated modeling but it is a conglomeration of several years of expertise coming together and giving us, it's all in terms of likelihood, right? It's all in terms of how likely things are to happen. Now, there's very little doubt about the tipping points that we have in the climate. So that uncertainty has shrunken quite a bit in recent years. That's reflected in the language by the IPCC. But yes, but I agree. I'm probably more on the optimistic camp that we need to push as far as we can to get the discussion in the right direction. But it all comes down to the Thursday evening negotiations just before the Friday draft, which goes out to the world. So it's a bit of hope plays a big part in that as well.
That was nicely put. Dan, when you look into your crystal ball over the next few decades, what do you see? What's going to happen? How does it compare to what should happen?
Yeah. I think Jean-Marc laid it out pretty well. I did want to maybe define. So I'm also a big fan of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I've helped develop the aviation pathway on that, so I know that pretty well. And I do think that interim targets are important, and companies making commitments above and beyond what governments can negotiate will be important. But just to, maybe define the science a little bit more clearly. There are different temperature thresholds, right? So Paris tells us we need to get the world on a well below 2 degree pathway. That's sort of code language for 1.75 degrees Celsius temperature increase, and also aspire to hit to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there are multiple targets in there. 1.5 is just really tough, especially if you say, okay, shipping and aviation are going to be held to the same standards as other modes, and they're not going to be allowed to increase their share of a carbon budget over time. 1.5 is very, very hard. I will say definitively for aircraft, according to our research, 1.5 degrees, holding emissions at 2019, like share of emissions at 2019 levels, that is not achievable in my opinion. 1.75 is achievable. That's when we throw all of our technologies at the sector. 1.75 proportional carbon budget, that is achievable. And I'm quite confident we'll stay below 2 degrees. I think humanity needs to do it, and we will do it. There are different ways you can approach this. If you say, okay, shipping and aviation are more difficult to abate than other sectors, therefore they deserve a larger share of future carbon budgets, then something like a 1.5 degree trajectory does come into possibility. But again, that would be giving a larger share of future emissions. So that's what I see. I think 2 degrees is quite achievable. 1.5 would require, in essence, special treatment or a larger share of the pie. And 1.75, I think, without increasing emissions for aviation is also achievable.
Okay, thank you. Sobering. Let me do one audience question before we run out of time. And Jean-Marc, this is to you. We get the question, whatever happened to IMO 2020? Success, failure, mixed results?
So IMO 2020, for those who might not be familiar, is a regulation that limits the sulfur content of fuels on board. I'd say it depends how you measure success. I think we've definitely seen a big shift in fuel supply, but also fuel use. There was a whole discussion about, well, what do I do? Switch fuel or try to take the sulfur out of the emissions? But I think it has been successful in at least changing the normal sort of status quo fuel for shipping into something that is, has very much less sulfur than it used to have. So I think it has been successful to a certain extent. And I think shipping has done quite well when it comes to pollution, especially around coastal areas as well, with emission control zones being implemented as well. So I think, the jury is still out probably because it's a bit too early to see the big impact of it. But it definitely has changed behavior and the way people think about sourcing their fuel and what technologies they chose on board their ships.
That's great. Well, we have not run out of interesting things to talk about, but we have run out of time. Let me thank all of you, David, Jean-Marc, Dan, for sharing your expertise with us and for a great conversation. Thanks to all of you in the audience for attending today's session. We will email out the slides and link to this recording tomorrow morning. There will also be a short feedback survey presented when you log off of this call. Please take a moment to share your thoughts and feedback with the team so we can continue to curate content for you. Thank you all and have a good day.